A secret is shaking the halls of power in Washington. One of America's oldest allies is quietly walking toward the door. And if this happens, the world as we know it may never be the same. The whispers began so faintly that most people didn't even notice. Buried in background noise, tucked away in the margins of diplomatic chatter, a strange phrase kept surfacing: Canada and BRICS. At first, it sounded absurd, the kind of thing you'd dismiss as a translation error or a journalist's typo. Why would Canada, a founding member of NATO, a pillar of the G7, and America's closest neighbor, ever consider aligning itself with a bloc that includes Russia, China, and countries actively challenging Western dominance? Yet the whispers didn't fade, they grew louder. What started as an offhand remark in a closed-door briefing became a talking point in international think tanks. Then came the reports. Major outlets across Europe and Asia began publishing eerily similar stories at the same time. Sources inside the Canadian government confirmed it. United Nations diplomats went on record. This wasn't speculation anymore. Formal discussions were taking place. Real meetings, real agendas, real possibilities. Canada wasn't just flirting with the idea of joining BRICS, it was seriously considering it. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Canada represents. This is not some small nation hedging its bets. This is a G7 economy, a country with the world's third largest oil reserves, a nation that shares the longest undefended border on Earth with the United States. Canada and America don't just trade with each other, they're woven together. Supply chains cross back and forth dozens of times before a single product is finished. Defense systems are integrated. Intelligence is shared. Families span both sides of the border. For generations, Canada has been the definition of a reliable Western ally. It stood with America through 2 world wars, the Cold War, and every major conflict since. It helped build the institutions that define the current global order: the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. Canada didn't just participate in the Western-led system, it helped design it. So what on earth could push a country like that toward BRICS? The answer, according to analysts who've been watching this unfold, lies in a single word: pressure. When Donald Trump returned to the White House, he brought with him a worldview that treats allies like competitors and diplomacy like a transaction. His administration wasted no time making that clear. On July 15th, Trump signed an executive order launching a sweeping review of trade agreements with neighboring countries. 2 days later, the hammer fell. New tariffs landed on Canadian lumber, steel, aluminum, and dairy products. These weren't minor adjustments. They were direct hits to some of Canada's most vital industries. But that was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Canadian pharmaceutical companies found themselves locked out of United States supply chains. Tech firms in Toronto and Vancouver were suddenly barred from competing for American government contracts. There were no negotiations, no warnings, just abrupt, unilateral decisions handed down from Washington. Trump didn't hide his reasoning. In a post on social media, he declared that America had been too generous for too long and that the days of playing nice were over. His message was blunt: America comes first, everyone else comes second. For Canadians, this wasn't just economic policy. It felt personal. It felt like betrayal. Prime Minister Mark Carney's response was measured, but the frustration was impossible to miss. In a carefully worded statement, he said that Canada would no longer allow its economic future to be held hostage by the short-term political whims of any single country. He promised that Canada would diversify its partnerships and strengthen ties with nations that valued mutual respect. At the time, most people assumed he was talking about Europe, maybe Japan or South Korea. Few imagined he was already in conversations with Beijing. Because while the United States was slamming doors, China was quietly opening them. The outreach didn't happen in grand public forums. It happened in private, discreetly, strategically. Meetings were arranged in cities far from the Western media spotlight: Singapore, Dubai, Shanghai, Zurich. Senior Canadian officials sat across tables from Chinese diplomats and economic planners. At first, the discussions focused on trade and investment, safe topics, predictable topics. But then the conversations deepened. China didn't just offer Canada access to its massive consumer market. It offered infrastructure financing. It offered collaboration on cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and green energy. It offered an alternative to the economic uncertainty that was rapidly defining Canada's relationship with Washington. And then, according to sources who spoke to Bloomberg, the talks went even further. One meeting in Zurich reportedly lasted nearly 11 hours. The agenda covered energy partnerships, agricultural exports, technology transfers, and currency diversification. But the most explosive topic was saved for last, the possibility of Canada joining BRICS as a full member. If that happens, it would shatter every assumption about the global order. No advanced Western democracy has ever joined BRICS. Not one. The bloc was designed for emerging economies seeking an alternative to Western-dominated institutions. But if a country like Canada crosses that line, BRICS stops being a club for the developing world. It becomes something entirely different, a genuine rival to the G7, a legitimate counterpole in a fracturing global system. Washington's reaction was swift and furious. Within hours of the news leaking, the White House issued a statement expressing grave concern and warning of serious consequences for any nation that undermined American leadership. Trump followed with a characteristically blunt threat, saying that if Canada continued down this path, the United States would respond with severe economic measures. But here's the thing. Canada had already started moving. In June alone, Canada's trade with China surged by 18%. A massive uranium supply agreement with India was finalized. Brazil's state-owned energy giant, Petrobras, announced plans to open a regional headquarters in Toronto. South Africa and Canada entered negotiations over rare earth minerals and platinum, resources critical for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles. And perhaps most tellingly, Canada began experimenting with something that would have been unthinkable just a year ago, settling trade payments in Chinese yuan and Indian rupees instead of US dollars. That last detail is crucial. For decades, the dollar has been the undisputed king of global finance. It's the currency used in international oil sales, in cross-border loans, in central bank reserves. The dollar's dominance isn't just an economic advantage for the United States, it's a geopolitical weapon. It allows Washington to impose sanctions, freeze assets, and exert influence in ways no other country can. But that dominance depends on one thing: trust. Trust that the dollar will remain stable. Trust that the United States will remain a predictable, reliable leader. And increasingly, that trust is eroding. When Trump announced additional tariffs on Canadian-made vehicles, targeting the manufacturing heartlands of Ontario and Quebec, the impact was immediate. Canadian stock markets tumbled, the loonie weakened, investors panicked. Entire industries that depend on cross-border supply chains suddenly faced existential uncertainty. Yet even as the economic pain intensified, Canada's diplomatic outreach to BRICS countries didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated. Senior Canadian finance officials reportedly delivered a stark assessment to the Prime Minister's office. Canada had become too dependent on the United States, and that dependence was now a liability. The idea of building stronger economic ties outside North America, once considered fringe, was now being discussed at the highest levels of government. This shift reflects a broader concern. The United States, long seen as the anchor of the global system, is increasingly viewed as erratic. Policy reversals, sudden tariffs, threats of economic punishment, all of it has created an environment of uncertainty. Meanwhile, BRICS countries are positioning themselves as offering something the West no longer guarantees: stability. BRICS isn't just talk anymore, it has real infrastructure. The new development bank, headquartered in Shanghai, has already funded billions of dollars in projects across the developing world. The bloc has created financial mechanisms that allow member countries to trade in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. These aren't hypothetical systems. They're operational. They're being used right now. For Canada, the question is no longer whether alternatives to the US-dominated system exist. The question is whether those alternatives might actually be better. Recently, Canadian officials attended an economic summit in Kazan, Russia. There, they held private discussions with representatives from China, Russia, and Iran. Reports suggest they expressed interest in payment systems that operate independently of SWIFT, the Western-controlled financial messaging network. They also inquired about digital currencies being developed in Asia. In Washington, these moves are seen as treachery. In Ottawa, they're seen as insurance. And Canada isn't alone in rethinking its options. In the United Kingdom, economists are openly debating strategies that balance engagement with both Western and BRICS markets. In France, political voices are warning against over-reliance on the dollar. In Italy, leaders are calling for greater flexibility in a multipolar world. If even one G7 nation formally joins BRICS, the psychological impact would be seismic. It would signal that the Western-led order is no longer inevitable, that the dollar's reign is not eternal, that alternatives exist and they're real. And right now, all eyes are on Canada. Just months ago, the idea seemed laughable. Today, it's being discussed in government offices, in boardrooms, in newsrooms around the world. The unthinkable is becoming thinkable. The U.S. The response has been, well, predictably aggressive. New tariffs on Canadian oil exports are reportedly under consideration. In response, Canada is exploring its own countermeasures, including restrictions on American access to critical resources like rare earth elements and nuclear materials. This is no longer just about trade. It's about strategy. It's about the future. And then came another signal, one that sent chills through Washington. At the United Nations, Canada abstained from a United States-backed resolution condemning China. It was a small procedural vote, the kind that usually goes unnoticed. But in the context of everything else, it was, well, deafening. Canada, for the first time in recent memory, refused to automatically align itself with American foreign policy. The irony is almost poetic. The harder the United States tries to pull its allies closer, the faster they seem to drift away. Pressure that was meant to enforce loyalty is instead breeding resentment. Control that was meant to preserve dominance is instead accelerating fragmentation. BRICS, once dismissed as a loose coalition of second-tier economies, is now being taken seriously. Countries from across the global south are expressing interest in joining or deepening ties. And if Canada, a wealthy, stable Western democracy, decides to send even observers to a BRICS summit, it would send shockwaves through every capital in Europe and North America. A full membership? That would be historic. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The United States would have very few good options. Sanctions would hurt both countries. Political threats would lack credibility. Media campaigns would only deepen divisions. The real loss would be symbolic. The quiet departure of one of America's most trusted allies, not through war, not through ideology, but through cold, calculated economic pragmatism. This isn't hypothetical anymore. This is happening, right now. Canada, the country that stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States for over a century, is exploring a future where that partnership is no longer central. United States defense officials are reportedly reviewing northern security arrangements. Lawmakers are questioning long-standing treaties. Financial markets are reacting, with industries dependent on cross-border trade showing visible strain. Internal assessments warn that the deeply integrated North American economy could begin to unravel. If Canada ultimately makes the leap, historians may look back on this moment as a turning point. Not just for North America, but for the entire global system. It would be proof that the era of unchallenged American dominance is over. That the world is no longer revolving around a single superpower. That we are entering something new, something uncertain, something multipolar. And it all started with a whisper. The world is changing faster than most of us realize. Old alliances are cracking, new ones are forming, and the rules we thought were permanent are being rewritten in real time. Whether Canada ultimately joins BRICS or not, one thing is already clear: the future will not look like the past. The only question left is whether we're ready for what comes next. Thanks for watching. If this story made you think, hit that like button and subscribe. The world isn't slowing down, and neither are we. See you in the next one.